close all this down. All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And sorry for the late start. We're starting just a couple minutes late. Dr. Keith's computer decided to implode right before we started this video chat, but he's back with us now. So hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wit and Wisdom. My name is Corey DeVos. With me, as always, is my good friend, Dr. Keith. Dr. Keith, how are you, man?
Well, I'm pretty good, given that my computer just crashed. Luckily, I had another one.
Well, Happy New Year, man. It's good to see you. It's the
Happy
first
New
show
Year to you and everybody.
Yeah, definitely.
Good.
Yeah. And so today we've got some pretty cool stuff to talk about. So today we're going to be talking about, all of this is in the context of integral mindfulness, which is the title of one of your books.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and it's a great book. I highly recommend everyone out there pick it up, give it a read. Some really good stuff in there. And so today what we're going to be talking about is actually the evolution of shame, of disgust, and of moral discernments. And I think this is a big item, particularly now, Keith, as we're sort of moving into a new year, kind of setting new intentions, and kind of trying to feel through. I think a lot of us are trying to feel through. Where's our resistance? A lot of us have habits or patterns of behavior that we know we want to change. That maybe even feel that like we absolutely need to change in order to find more happiness and fulfillment in our lives. But there's resistance, and that resistance, I think, can come, really from so many different parts of our being, so many different stages that we contain within us, from which these kind of patterns of resistance can emerge and can actually, prevent us from feeling the fulfillment that we're longing for, and can even sort of erode at our willpower, our actual will to practice and our will to change and to transform in the first place. So I think this is going to be a really useful discussion. And before we begin, I just want to do a little bit of basic housekeeping. So for all of you guys who are joining us today, who are either in the Zoom app or watching on the integrallife.com/live page, as you watch this conversation, there's a couple ways that you can participate if you want to. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask in real time, what you do is if you're watching on the live page, there should be a link right underneath the video player. If you click that, it'll take you to the Zoom player. If you don't see it there, it should be in the email that you received about this. Get into the Zoom player. Once you're in there, you have a couple options. You can either press the raise my hand button, which lets us know that you want us to actually turn on your camera and you can ask your question in real time, and we'll have this back and forth. Or you can hit the Q&A button and submit a written question, which we'll read on the air, and we'll discuss that way. So a couple different ways that you can interact with us. We always love it when you guys join the conversation. So please, if you have something to say, please do. So Keith's just gonna clean his nose a little bit, and then and we'll be good to go.
Can we edit that out? I feel disgusted with myself for cleaning my nose.
No shame.
Yeah, there's a little bit there.
So Keith, take it away, man.
First of all, Happy New Year, everybody. Happy New Year. Hope you had a good one. I hope you're going to have a good one. It's my pleasure to talk with everybody, connect with you guys again. Just turned it sound like a spaceship taking off. No, it stopped. All of us in Integral, we're all evolutionaries. It's an interesting thing. We all are interested in our own personal evolution, our ontological evolution. We're interested in the evolution of consciousness, and we're all developmentalists. We're all interested in development. We're interested in how we develop, other people develop, that kind of stuff. But sometimes we don't really pay attention to exactly what that means. Okay, the way that everything gets enacted in the world, in us, is through our unconscious, our adaptive unconscious, sending us messages via emotions, impulses, thoughts, stories, perspectives that are in response to our internal environment, our interior experiences, and our connections with each other and with the external environment. And as we do that with some kind of conscious intent often, but not always, we get these messages that come up. And these messages can either be constructive or destructive, more constructive or destructive, depending upon how we're oriented in the current moment. And, you know, my book Shadowlight is all about that from a lot of different perspectives. Well, these emotions are interesting. You know, I've been a psychotherapist for 45 years. And if you're in the field, you begin to get a sense of people colonizing the upper left and the upper and lower right about emotion from the lower left. People have a sense to say, shame is a bad emotion and love is a good emotion. Moral disgust is bad, joy is good. Okay, there's a subtle sense of right and wrong that slips in to how we evaluate emotions. And this is a mistake when it happens. Now, some emotions are more dangerous than others. You know, joy can be dangerous, but it is way less frequently dangerous than shame, for instance. But it can be. Same way with love. There are no bad emotions. All the emotions are there to help us grow and protect us and guide us and give us information and integrate it into our lives and stuff. And especially people misunderstand shame and moral disgust. I have a book that I wrote called The Gift of Shame that was written specifically about shame as a social emotion. And so one of the reasons I wanted to do this show is I went, okay, so when we developed, the way that we develop is largely social. You know, we have social relationships with all the different parts of ourselves, and we have social relationships with other people. If we put all those things together, that's 90 to 95% of a human being's existence. Our social connections are intimately tied in with approvals and disapprovals with each other, and they're tied in with shame and moral disgust, okay? And they're very important. And so particularly the shame emotions are important, you know, embarrassment, chagrin, guilt, that kind of stuff. And they're necessary for us to live good lives. They're necessary for us to move through the different levels of moral development. They're necessary for us to have coherent cultures, family cultures, larger cultures, and so on. When appropriately processed, shame and moral disgust become spiritual guides. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today. And particularly, I wanted to talk about that tendency to pathologize emotion. And when instead of pathologizing emotion, like we want to get away from shame, we want to get away from guilt, we want to get away from criticism. For instance, a typical green indictment is you just criticize me. There's a subtle undercurrent in green of it's not appropriate to criticize another person. Okay, well, sorry. In social environments, you know, we approve and disapprove of each other all the time. And what I want you to do is I want you to criticize me in a good way, you know, for me, you know, that feels good, that feels virtuous, that feels okay by my lower left standards, and that's useful for me. Okay? I don't want you to not criticize me. I want you to do it in a way that's an optimal way of doing it. And now we're beginning to come into the whole integral approach to emotion. There's better ones, there's worse ones, which is how do they all fit together? So let me talk just for a little bit about how this fits together developmentally. Okay? Shame and moral disgust are social. What do I mean by that? There's not a separate enough sense of self in an infant to feel shame until 10 or 11 months. You know, infants don't blush until around 10 or 11 months. There's now at 10 or 11 months, there's enough sense of a separate self where if there's a disapproval, they'll enter a shame response. They'll go into parasympathetic collapse. Their neck muscles will get weak. They'll look down. They'll try to disappear. They'll be immobilized. They'll blush. And they'll have that uncomfortable affect of shame. Now, for a securely attached kid, if mom says, no, don't run into the street, and he feels that sense and he freezes as he's going to the street, when she picks up that 11 or 12 or 13 or 14-month-old kid, within about 10 seconds, they're back to feeling good again. Okay, but a little bit of social learning has taken place. And around 24 months to 30 months, kids develop language and they begin to be able to observe themselves and give approvals and disapprovals of themselves. up to the point where by 4 or 5, a child will behave in a moral fashion by themselves when they don't experience themselves being observed by another person. Why is that? Because if they observe themselves breaking a rule, and at that point they basically have magical rules, beginning to have mythic rules at 4 or 5, they'll feel a shame emotion, they don't like it, and then they'll want to follow the rule, and they'll feel a sense of interior approval. And this continues with us through our various moral systems. And as I've talked about in other episodes, we grow through an including and a trend process through different moral systems, all of them anchored in place by shame and moral disgust. We can't feel disgust until we're 4 or 5 years old. It's a very complex affect. Our brains have to be quite mature to be able to feel it. And there's 3 kinds of disgust. One kind is just with icky stuff, wormy, icky stuff. That's one kind of disgust. But there's 2 other kinds. Another kind is we get disgusted by sexual practices that we don't like, which I find hilarious. Like there's everything I like, and then there's everything else that's disgusting. That's pretty funny, okay? The third form of disgust we'll feel is moral disgust. And we'll feel moral disgust at ourselves if we observe ourselves violating a value or observe somebody else. Now, developmentally, we'll start with visceral moral systems that are driven by our genes. People, we were born scared of heights in the dark and snakes and spiders. But then we quickly develop as we grow a magical moral system where it's wrong because we've discovered it's wrong, to a mythical moral system where it's based on a framework, often religious, to a rational moral system where it has to make sense, to a pluralistic moral system where the moral system involves people being cared for and people having rights, to an integral moral system that's very relativistic. Every single level of this moral system is anchored in place by approvals and disapprovals from other people and ourselves that result in us feeling approved of or approving, or us feeling ashamed or disapproving or morally disgusted with other people. Now, there are different ways of this manifesting, and some of them are quite destructive. And there is such a thing as toxic shame. There is such a thing as a devastating moral disgust. The painful emotions are quite dangerous. Rage is a dangerous emotion. It's not a bad emotion, it's a dangerous emotion. Anger, anxiety, depression, shame, guilt, chagrin, moral disgust. They're dangerous, but they're not bad. What we want to do is we want to use them appropriately. And I'm going to tell a little story about a couple using shame and moral disgust in a complex and healthy way, and then another couple doing it differently. And so here's that story. So here's this couple, okay? Sally and George. Sally and George go to a party. So they're at a party, and Sally and George are talking to their friends, Gertrude and Irving. Okay, so all of a sudden, George he's on his second drink. He starts telling a story about how he missed a train in Spain and ended up in Portugal and how it was really funny. Okay, so now his wife has heard this before. Okay, Sally's heard this before. The other 2 haven't. They listen kind of interested, but George kind of gets lost in his story, and the other couple starts to twitch. She notices that he doesn't. And so she kind of feels a little bit of disapproval of him. Okay, but she kind of tries to give him a glance. Whether he gets it or not, it's hard to say, but he finishes the story, and she recognizes that he lost attunement with our friends and went on and on. Okay, so they're driving home that night. She decides to not talk about it because it's late. They've drunk some alcohol and stuff. She wakes up to the next morning. She says, last night when you were telling the story about missing the train and everything, it started out well, but then you went on and on. And I saw them get uncomfortable, and you didn't seem to notice. And he immediately feels a little sense of shame in that. He's being disapproved of. And then shame, usually what we'll do to defend against it is we regulate it, our nervous system's regulated humiliation and rage. So he starts feeling a little bit of anger towards her. He goes, no, she's just trying to help. And he goes, now that I think of it, I really wasn't paying attention to them. I was caught up in the story. She said, yeah. And then I was a little embarrassed. He goes, well, I'm sorry you were embarrassed. And she said, well, thanks. And he says, well, what do you think I should do about it? She says, well, stay connected to your friends when you're telling the story. He goes, that's a great idea. I'll do that next time. She said, well, thank you. They give each other a hug. Okay, now, that looks like an ordinary, simple interaction with that couple. It looks effortless. It looks like no big deal. That's actually reflecting a highly complex series of self-regulations, of self-awareness, and of intersubjective co-regulation and development that caused them to get a little bit deeper and more intimate with each other. Okay. So that now there were shame emotions in that. There was moral disgust that she felt for him when he was going on and not noticing it. He felt ashamed, and she felt a little bit ashamed being associated with him around that. They had to regulate that. He felt ashamed, a little bit irritated when she told him about it. He had to regulate that. They had to keep on going deeper. They knew what they were doing until they got to a point where they both felt better and they felt like they were moving a little bit forward in terms of being close with each other and being effective with other people. And that's how moral disgust and shame ideally is used by people. Helps us grow socially, interiorly, and intersubjectively. Okay. And there's just a lot of names for these emotions. Okay. I'm using the word moral disgust specifically. Somebody just asked the question, isn't that a strong word? Yes, it's a strong word. I'm using it specifically because it is a specific neurobiological state that becomes a capacity at 4 or 5. Okay, so here we go. So that's one couple. Okay, now we have, say, the same couple, or a different couple that is not, they're not as complex. They're not as mature. So they're at the couple and he's going on, and she looks at him, she gets embarrassed, and she thinks to herself, contemptuously, what a dick. She's feeling a sense of moral disgust for him. And she says, God, she's boring everybody with this long story. He immediately feels shame, humiliation, and rage. He turns to her and he says, there you go again. Ms. Emasculation. You just can't pass a pair of testicles without trying to clip them off, right? She blushes, just completely gets humiliated and walks away. The couple just stands there, deer in the headlights going, God, we just saw something outrageously ugly. They're driving home together and she says, how dare you say something like that in front of our friends? He says, how dare you tell me that I'm boring my friends? They scream and shout at each other. They go home. They go to sleep without saying anything. They wake up. He feels pretty good when he wakes up, and then he remembers what she said. And then he starts telling himself the story again, which is one of the ways that we stay in defensive states. We keep amplifying our distorted story rather than challenging our distorted story. And by the time she opens her eyes, he's already pissed at her. She opens her eyes, sees his expression, and she remembers him, and she goes, God, you were such an incredible asshole. And then they do it again. Now, this looks like there's a lot of contact. There isn't very much contact here. There's just two isolated people yelling at an object. It looks like there is an awful lot of complexity here. Really not much complexity here. They're both caught into primitive defensive states. They're not aware of it. And as a result of it, they're destined to have whatever they do with conflict. Some couples avoid it. Some couples have escalating conflict. Whatever happens, as long as it's not changed into compassionate self-awareness and interpersonal resolution, it degrades the relationship and degrades each person, slows down their development. Okay, so we don't want to be that second person or that second couple. We want to be that first person, that first couple. How do we do that? Enter integral mindfulness. So the first thing that we do is we become aware with acceptance and caring intent of what we're feeling, thinking, sensing, judging, and wanting. Okay, when we're aware with acceptance and caring intent of what we're sensing, feeling, thinking, judging, and wanting, we are strengthening the witness, the compassionate witness. Okay, all forms of healing involve strengthening that witness. If you look at all the trauma treatments, say internal family systems, they have what they call the self is the compassionate witness. You look in the spiritual systems, okay, Atman, soul, and so on. If you go to that point where we're just pure undifferentiated spirit, at that moment where we become, Keith or Corey, whoever, that's that compassionate witness. That's that self. Or what Ken says, the witness is that awareness that we have at a point where we observe all the world, everything, all the objects in the universe as objects, but it's itself not an object. That's self. So every time we do that, observe with acceptance and caring intent what I'm sensing, feeling, or what you're sensing, feeling, thinking, judging, wanting. We're strengthening that witness. We're strengthening that observing self, which is great. Okay, so when we do that and we have that awareness, the integral mindfulness part comes. Now what do? What integral provides is a cosmological map that instructs us about what is the most healthy from horizontal health and most healthy from a vertical health action, thought, behavior to do at any given moment. And you'll notice with the first couple, that's what they did. They were observing themselves going into these reactions, but they didn't lose their sense of, I love this person. My job is to be supportive, and to be supported, my job isn't to attack. Okay, there was that understanding. That's what happens when you have an integrated consciousness. You never forget those deeper voices that say, I want to do right. And then within that particular position, as you're observing, you go, so now what can I do that will serve the highest good? Well, with the first couple, it was we help each other wake up, we help each other grow up a little bit, we help each other clean up a little bit, and then we'll help each other show up better the next time. And that's integral mindfulness. Now, practically speaking, when we go out into the world, say somebody comes to me in a therapy session and they have some bad habit of criticizing themselves. Every time I make a mistake, I just give myself lots of shit. Okay? Now, I understand how that happens. When you feel a sense of distress, you can tend to enter, your nervous system feels threatened. You tend to enter a defensive state, and that defensive state has amplified or numbed emotions and distorted stories and perspectives and destructive impulses and diminished capacities for empathy and self-reflection. So I know that person is entering a defensive state when they make a mistake and feel ashamed, and they tend to amplify the story and keep it going. And so I said, well, you have this bad habit of amplifying your shame story instead of saying, well, what did I do wrong? What can I do about it? Let's develop a new habit of what did I do wrong? What can I do about it? And they go, sure. Now, if that person goes out and develops that new habit and practices it, great, problem solved. But what if they have difficulty doing that? What if they find themselves having resistances doing that? What that means is that they have some kind of trauma programming, probably. Some kind of interior place, part of them that doesn't want to give up that tendency to amplify shame when they have it. That's associated with some kind of survival characteristic. Everything that we experience in our consciousness originally was a solution. It was a solution to a problem. And so there's no part of ourselves that wasn't originally intended by our nervous system, by our soul spirit system to do something good. Okay, so now we have to go deeper. And then there's lots of different ways of going deeper. And the way we go deeper is we find where that shame is, or where that moral disgust is, and we just kind of follow it down. Who's the person that's criticizing? Who's the part of me that's criticizing? What's the part of me that's being criticized? What are the emotions associated with those? Where do I feel them in my body? How do I enact them in the world? And as we explore these things, then we become more integrated. And there's lots of nuances to this that I won't get into, and there's lots of different systems that do this in different fashion. Some I like better than others. All of them are effective. But basically, this is how we grow. We're either developing new capacities, or we find ourselves resisting developing new capacities. And then, okay, now we need to find out that resistance, and we need to integrate the parts of ourselves that are resisting. Because when we have one impulse to grow, another impulse to resist growth, that's an internalized conflict. That's what Freud's definition was of neurosis, internalized conflict. Now, a mistake that Freud made, and that a lot of psychotherapists have made since then, is they tend to pathologize different parts of ourselves. The inner critic. People tend to hate their inner critic. Well, I'm sorry, that inner critic is there to do good stuff. So we don't want to hate our inner critic. We want to make our inner critic an ally. And the way to do that is let the inner critic know, we know you're trying to do something good. So, let's figure that out and let me help you do something good. And I've had many dialogues with inner critics over the years doing that, which reflects one other thing that I want to mention. We have this human superpower of being able to invest anything with consciousness. Therapists have been noticing this forever, since Carl Jung. Shaman have been doing it probably for 200,000 years, since we became, we woke up with the FOXP2 mutation 200,000 years ago. What I mean by that is I can see a part of myself that's shame, and I can say, shamed part of Keith, what are you feeling? And actually then I will become the shamed part of Keith, actually have a personality that responds. Well, I'm feeling ashamed that I made a mistake. I can do that with an object. I can look at your coffee cup and go, Corey, coffee cup, boy, I really like you. And then I can be Corey Coffee Cup and says, yeah, I'm an integral coffee cup. Corey has a whole collection of me, and I represent the old Integral Institute to him, which makes him feel good. I go, well, it makes me, you see, I'm imbuing that with, so when we deal with these different parts of ourselves, we use this superpower to imbue them with consciousness. And when we do that, that gives us opportunities to integrate. Now, shame is dangerous. Moral disgust is dangerous. You know, it's a parasympathetic collapse, and our nervous system knows it, and it tries to defend against it with defensive states. That's where a lot of the defensive states come from. They come from us defending against shame emotions when we were very, very young, probably 11, 12, 13, 15, 18 months. And then when we have a defense, that defense will stop us from adequately processing those emotions. And so we need to be able to do that. So when we feel ashamed, rather than try to avoid it, it's more effective to go, what am I ashamed of? I violated a standard. What was the standard? You know, if the standard is boring people at a party, then I should follow that standard and be more socially attuned. If the standard is, if the value is too rigid a value, if someone says, how do you like my dress? And I say, I think it's an ugly dress. And she gets all offended. I go, maybe my standard about telling the truth needs to be a little bit more relativistic. Okay? Maybe I should tell the truth, except when somebody asks me if I like her dress, and I should tell her it's a pretty dress, unless, you know, I don't know. I can't think of an exception actually for that one. So then I've refined my moral standard. And as we do this, we help ourselves grow. Now, remember, since moral standards, our moral development is included in Transcend, we have all our more primitive moral systems. And what's complicated about this is I might be functional at teal, but I get threatened. I'm going to then regress back down to red and amber.
Yep.
Okay, so if somebody hurts me, I'm at teal. Okay, I'm all compassionate. I'm all, highest good for everybody. Somebody, hurts me. Somebody runs into my car and says it's your fault. Okay, well then all of a sudden I've regressed down to a red moral system. In the red moral system, what I want is revenge. I want to go screw up with their car. Or maybe I don't go that far. Maybe I go to amber. The amber moral system is they need to be punished. Now, the difference between revenge and punishment is punishment has to do with some kind of system. Or maybe I go, no, that's not right. I should go to my orange moral system. Orange moral system goes, this is against the rules. Let's find the structure of the society that we have that makes us a successful society. Let's get a cop in here. Let's do all the things that we need to do so we can successfully negotiate this problem. Or I might go to my green moral system. My green moral system is a poor person, which they're probably really distressed about after running into my car. I should calm them down and help them feel better, because that's what's most important, that we feel better. Okay. You can shift your moral system at any time that you want, or any time you do. You just kind of discover yourself doing it. You don't decide to do it. But if you discover yourself regressing to a more primitive one via a defensive state, you can always catch it if you have integral mindfulness and reference your leading edge moral system, which tends to be our integral moral system. It's relativistic. It's what serves the highest good. Hierarchy is fine in an integral moral system. Right and wrong works in an integral moral system. Punishment is used strategically if it needs to support development or protect the culture. In the integral moral system, revenge is regulated out of the system because revenge generally creates more violence. I assume there's exceptions to that. I've never encountered one, and so on. So this is how it all fits together. You notice how what we're ashamed of, or what we feel moral disgust, will change from red to as we go through different levels. Mm-hmm. And one good example of this is I was talking to Elizabeth Cook-Reuter and Bina, and they said that so many of the people,
Suzanne
Bina Sharma. Oh, Suzanne, yeah, I'm sorry. I apologize. Suzanne, oof. just a little slip. Anyway, I was talking to them, and they said that a lot of the people that they work with are at a 3-4, what they call 3-4 level. It's a level between 3 and 4. These are people that self-identify as rational, but they have confirmation bias. You give them data that goes against something that they believe in, and their immediate response is to push against it. It's an unconscious reaction because it's embarrassing to be wrong. Okay, there's still a little bit in that amber. If you're wrong, you're bad. Okay, if you're not right, so you can't admit being wrong. This is what Republicans have done forever. I can't change my mind, or I'm wrong, or I look bad. Can't change my mind. Can't admit that I was wrong. And so it's very difficult for that stage to take in data and change their opinion. You make it all the way to 4, you give data that shows you how you can be more successful or more something, much more easily change your opinion. Why? It's no longer as wrong to make a mistake. Okay, your moral system has shifted into that value mean. Okay? And so what's moral and immoral is heavily culturally determined. And and not only that, it's not just value meme. I mean, an amber Christian person and an amber Christian person and an amber Buddhist person, they're going to have different values because there was different cultures that they grew up in, even though they're still coming from amber altitude. So there's the complexity of shame and moral disgust, the necessity of them. And remember one last thing about this, about emotions. As we develop our capacity to experience emotions, just like everything else, it's a developmental line. We start with just physical sensations and action tendencies as infants. We begin to have individual emotions that we can identify as toddlers and as 2 and 3-year-olds. We begin to then experience blends of emotion where we can have 1 or 2 emotions at the same time. And then as we get older, we can have blends and blends of emotions. So I can observe myself loving my child in a store while my child is grabbing at the cornflakes and me getting pissed at them for grabbing the cornflakes. And I just get strangle them for doing it, but I love them, of course, and I want to teach them to not grab for cornflakes. But also I'm embarrassed because of the person on the other side is observing that and thinking I'm a bad father on account of I'm being nasty to my. Okay, that's a lot of emotions happening at once that I'm aware of. Okay. That capacity of experiencing more and more emotions and recognizing how they all fit together naturally and form a coherent moment is a developmental achievement. And the more that we're aware of it, practicing integral mindfulness, the more choices we have about what to do and what do we want to do. We want to serve the highest good. We want to wake up, grow up, clean up, and show up. And so there is shame and moral disgust fit into developmental orientation and why they're so necessary for being a human being.
Yeah, no, Keith, that was great and totally fascinating. And one of the things I really love about this, through some of the conversations that we've had prior to this, is how you actually do highlight the fact that shame actually can be, when wielded responsibly, shame can be a tremendously positive force.
Yes.
Both in our own consciousness and within our culture. It's shame. Healthy shame is basically supposed to be like a basement floor on what is allowed, either in terms of your individual behaviors or in culture at large. And once people start dipping below that line, that's, you get a response to that. And before we, a couple days ago, when you had sent me sort of the pitch for the show, I sent you a question because I was curious, how much of these shame responses are associated with particular developmental lines, cognitive line, values line, etc., and how much of this is coming from a view. And the difference there, Ken often uses the metaphor of ladder climber view. And just to break it down real briefly for you, the idea is that development is it's a poor metaphor because it's a little too rigid, but you can think of development as a ladder that's composed of many different rungs. And there's a climber going up that ladder, slowly over time. And the idea is each time the climber reaches up to a new rung and pulls himself up and looks out, he or she sees a different view. So the views change, irrevocably change from level to level to level. You're not going to have the same view today that you did 10 years ago because you're occupying a different place on the ladder. So therefore, what you see is going to be different. However, each of those rungs remains. So what I notice, Keith, as we're talking about this, is how often there will be something provoking a shame response within me. And it's some object that I see outside of myself in my view somewhere, right? So the
Yes,
higher up in that ladder I am, the more I can see. The more I can see, the more opportunities for to feel shame and disgusted I experience. Now,
there you go.
if I look at it a little more closely, I'll notice that the object in my view that is causing me to feel some degree of shame, when I look at it a little more closely, it's actually not coming from the object itself. It's not coming from anything in my view whatsoever. It's coming from a broken rung or a splinter or something, a damaged rung behind me in my own development. So, you know, again, something offends me out there while it's actually I'm carrying this offense within me for some reason. There's a squick within me that I'm actually projecting out there. And that can be really difficult, I think, for people to track, particularly before they actually hit, you know, sort of a vision logic construct aware level of their own conscious development, because, you know, it allows you more access to witness consciousness. It allows you a little bit more space to notice that, you know, my consciousness is bigger than this sort of reaction that I'm feeling right now. So I can actually, you know, turn that subject into an object and look at it and sit with it for a while and be present and kind of follow it wherever it takes me. And usually that's going to take me within. That's not going to lead me to other objects out there that I'm feeling ashamed of. But it seems like, you know, when we have these interval conversations, it's like, you know, it's really easy to kind of plot them out and come up with your sort of organizational chart of how, you know, where all the different sources of shame are coming from. But then it's like you press the play button and everything turns into this like bizarre alchemy where everything bleeds into everything else. And we have, you know, a good sense of where certain things are coming from, but it's messy in the moment, isn't it?
It really is. You know, the cover of my book, Integral Mindfulness, was done by Jeannie Carlisle, and it literally is a climber, a ladder, and a view. You know, it was one of my favorite covers of my books. And I've got 8 books, but of all the covers, that's one of my favorites. And this never stops being a source of challenge for us as human beings.
Right.
It never stops. Partly because, remember, we're getting stuff from our unconscious all the time, constructive and destructive stuff. And if we violated a value of any sort, if our nervous system determines that, part of the reaction is going to be one of the shame emotions, or perhaps moral disgust at us. Or if we observe somebody else doing it, we're going to have that reaction. That's just the template of social behavior. That's just how we navigate through the world. And it's very, very, very sensitive.
Yeah.
You know, if you have a button shirt and you go into an environment and you have one button unbuttoned, someone will look at that and it'll disturb them. That's going against the culture of having all your buttons buttoned, okay? Particularly if it's a middle button. If you notice it, you'll feel a little bit of embarrassment, a shame emotion. You know, and you'll button it up and whatever. Now, depending upon how you're programmed, that's no big deal, or that's enough to ruin your night, okay? Now, this is where the difference between healthy shame and toxic shame. If it's enough to ruin your night, you have some really bad habits of how you process shame emotions. And you know, what that does, and this is particularly devastating, that really encourages us to do anything that we can to avoid a shame emotion. And that generally means if someone disapproves of me, no, it's not me, it's you.
Right. Yeah.
All right?
Yep.
And now I'm invested in not me, you. I'm invested in avoiding the part of me that my nervous system wants me to heal.
Yep.
And I'm avoiding it because it's painful and it's dangerous.
Yep.
And so I'm going to just avoid it and avoid it and avoid it. And so I double down. It really is you. You go, no, it's not me, Keith, it's you. I go, oh, how dare you? Now I double down. And now what this creates is this isolates us. This creates that second couple. Instead, if I can learn to be interested, okay, our our observing ego, the witness, is interested in everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a natural curiosity that comes online.
Natural care and curiosity. And so if I'm observing with acceptance and caring intent the world, everything in the world is interesting.
Right.
You know, if I'm bringing that attention, including me, including my mistakes, including your mistakes, you know, including how I feel towards, if I'm angry at you, well, that's interesting. I'm mad at Corey. With Corey's, well, that's interesting. And also because it's acceptance and caring intent and I'm attuned to you, I want to help you not be mad at me because God, it must be uncomfortable to be mad at me, Corey. Let me help. I'm sorry, you know, that really helps. So this is how it's tied in. And you know, it's funny, I was doing a mind map the other night of this. And in the end, the mind map was all these different aspects of consciousness always combined together. Now, if we have an integrated consciousness, okay, an integrated consciousness is a consciousness where we don't lose parts of who we are under stress, okay? So think about that for a second, okay? Integrated consciousness is we don't lose parts of us under stress. And as we develop, if on a lot of lines, unless we're arrested at one of them, we develop more capacity to do this because we're able to take more perspectives. But when we get stressed, when I get upset, when I enter a defensive state, if I am observing myself enter the defensive state, and I know that there's an integral self that has a forward edge moral system, I'm interested in what that guy has to say about what's going on. I'll let that guy guide me, okay? But I have to be aware of him. If I lose awareness of him in my distress, remember you lose empathy and self-reflection in a defensive state, then I'm at the mercy of that state. Okay? If I have an idea that there's a part of me that's unacceptable, whether it's an angry part, a sexual part, a depressed part, a scared part, you know, the kinds of things that we're critical part, you know, then I'm going to try to avoid that part rather than integrate that part. Okay, now I'm not integrated anymore. I have somewhat of a fractured consciousness. And as I try to defend against that, it creates blind spots and capacities to hurt other people and be hurt myself. Now, a really good rule of thumb is if you are aware of shame and moral disgust and are always integrating it into those basic value systems and then making decisions off of your forward ed value system, that tends to integrate the whole system. And in integral mindfulness, that's what you do. You practice mindfulness until that's always a background hum of acceptance. I'm aware of what's going on in me and you with acceptance and caring intent. And then organizing how you're doing according to your integrally informed cosmology. Both in relationships and individually. And that naturally interesting leads into an integral life practice. If you're doing that, you're naturally attending to body, mind, spirit, and self, culture, and nature. You just naturally do it.
Right.
Healthy people tend to naturally do these things. Why? You know, because they're coming from that really clean witness self that's just on this side of pure spirit.
Yeah, it's wonderfully said. And we've got a couple questions, and you know, before we do, just one
Sure.
final comment, Keith, which is you know, it seems to me oftentimes too, like we're talking about how there can be an object of awareness that's making me that's triggering a response of shame or disgust or what have you. And oftentimes when we follow that, it can lead us to multiple places. You know, it's often not just sort of one cause, you know, one kind of broken rung within you that's provoking this. It can actually sort of cascade. You know, for example, I don't know if this is a secret to anyone, but I really don't like this Donald Trump guy very much.
Oh my God!
Yeah,
he's our president, Corey.
You know, I know.
Respect the office.
Well, and so this is the thing. So oftentimes the way Trump moves through the world, and therefore, you know, America moves through the world, it gives me a feeling of shame. And when I follow that down, I can see unhealthy aspects and I can see healthy aspects. But more interestingly, I can see which aspects are coming, like, you know, from my neocortex, and which aspects are coming from, you know, the fact that I'm a fucking primate and our alpha leader is not fit for the task, right? There's sort of an animalistic you know, sense of shame that comes with that. And it can be really hard to get at that. And the compassion that comes with that is like, oh, well, this is how a good number of people felt when Obama was president. And then, oh, this is how, you know, a lot of other people felt when, but so, I mean, this is always kind of going back and forth. And
Sure.
and whether it's, but this is what's interesting. So it's coming from this really pre-personal place, this pre-linguistic primal place, that can be very hard to sort of access with a conscious mind in a lot of ways. And yet so much of that response is dependent upon our view, upon what we're allowing ourselves to see or what we're preventing ourselves from seeing, which then in fact sort of galvanize our emotional responses and can, trigger these very, base kind of reactions within us.
Well, what they are is primitives. So as an integrated self in a tribe, if we see that the alpha is screwing up, then we need to go depose the alpha and create a new alpha. And if I'm a guy, I want to go do it. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. That's just coming from 5 million years of primate history.
Mhm.
Now, I had a dream about Trump the other day, and I was very proud of this dream because this dream was dealing with Trump strategically. Okay. In the dream, I was trying to make a deal with Trump. Okay. Like he has some orange characteristics. So I was going, well, I hope one way of dealing with his whole wall thing is maybe we can get a deal so that the dreamers can get helped out if we give him his wall. I'd be willing to sacrifice the giving him the wall so that we can get dreamers to be secure in the United States. That would be a pretty cool thing to do. Now, by doing that, that was my forward edge. That was now whether that's a good solution or not, at least the approach was what good thing can we do given the personalities of everybody involved. Yeah. I'm still aware of that primate part of me that wants to get rid of the dangerous alpha. Okay. But, that's really not, in my opinion, that doesn't serve the highest good as much as, what my dream gave me.
Right.
Okay. And so now you notice I have affection for your primate alpha and my primate alpha, and I have affection for my leading edge moral system too. But also, with depth of consciousness, the more depth of consciousness we have, the more responsibility we have.
That's right.
If I have a capacity to access my forward edge moral system, if I have a capacity to process my shame or my moral disgust at other people in a way that serves the highest good, then I have responsibility to do that. Okay. And I will be ashamed if I don't. Okay. Because that's the standard at that level. Okay. Right. And that's how shame becomes a spiritual guide.
Yeah.
I'll be morally disgusted with myself if I, fall into wanting to get revenge rather than try to serve the highest good. That's where moral disgust falls into a developmental system. That's why they're necessary.
Beautiful. All right. So shall we take some questions?
Love to take some questions.
Down? All right. So our first question is going to be from Raymond. So Raymond, I'm going to bring you on as a panelist. Sloan, we'll get to you next. And if anyone else has any questions, again, just join the Zoom app, press the raise my hand button. That'll let us know you want us to turn your cameras on. Otherwise, you can just press the Q&A button and submit a piece of writing, and we'll just read it on the air. So either way, Raymond,
hey, Raymond.
My friend.
Hey, oh, thank you guys. I just want to say, Dr. Keith, love it. Love your stuff, Corey. I love listening to both of you. And I am going to pick up all your books there, Dr. Keith. Thank you for influencing me.
You'll love them.
I love you. So I already sense it. I already sense the goodness in it.
Thank you.
So I believe I have two questions, if I may, Corey. I'm curious, I'm a mindset coach and I study philosophy very deeply. So I was introduced to Ken's stuff through Brian Johnson. And Brian, big, tall, skinny guy who's doing the sport.
Love him.
Amazing man, amazing human being. I have a question with parasympathetic collapse, and I notice that we can kind of see people who go through this. And I'm curious to know, what ways are there to regulate, right, from where we are? Because yes, different things do happen outside of us. External circumstances influence us. And for instance, my values are faith, courage, and self-regulation. So when I see someone have a parasympathetic collapse, how do we also observe ourselves to go to the better way, the better route? Is there some exercises around that to say, you know what, I'm experiencing this, I can go this way, 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. How can I see this and then bring it back and thread it to the best response possible?
Great question.
Okay, good question. So first of all, I'm going to have to paint with broad strokes here because There's just infinite nuances. The first thing to remember is that when we're in communication with each other, like right now, we are exchanging thousands of bits of information, and we are attuned with each other. Our nervous systems are regulating. At this particular point, your nervous system is recapitulating my state of consciousness, including my intentionality, as is mine with yours. If I'm in the presence of someone who begins to go into a parasympathetic collapse, and shame is one form of parasympathetic collapse, there are others, but let's talk about shame. Part of what happens, and I'll observe it because I'll feel them begin to disappear, and you'll see the blush, you'll see the eyes going down, the freezing and so on, and you'll feel it in your own body. So part of what I do is I stay connected. So initially I stay connected and go down a little bit. I go, wow, we're going into shame, aren't we? And they'll go, yeah. Now, at that particular point, they're not alone in it. Shame isolates us. Okay, but now we're in it, you and I. Okay, so I'm feeling it a little bit in here. That's where I feel shame. Where are you feeling it right now? Well, I'm feeling it a little bit here. Okay. And now we're beginning to explore it. Now, what I'm doing for a little bit is I'm allowing yourself, your observing witness, to borrow from mine. I'm kind of stepping in and strengthening yours. And now I'm saying, so now there's a lot of different ways you can go with this. So let's just go to the easiest way. So let's look at what you're ashamed at. What value do you think you're violating? And you look at, and you might say, well, I think okay, at that particular point now, the part that's ashamed is being observed by a part that's observing. And now you're not going into parasympathetic collapse anymore. You're back into social engagement. So stay with somebody and then getting them to observe that experience with interest, that regulates it. Now that's especially important because in change work, that's what we always want to do. We always want to strengthen the observing self so that they can engage with all the different other parts of themselves in the world in healthy, integrated fashion. Okay. And so if we're doing it for them or with them, we're doing it to guide that self, to strengthen that self so it's able to do it itself. So that is one really good way to do it. And there's a lot of others, but let's just stick with that one.
I'll take it. And Corey, I have a question for you. You spoke about the rungs of the ladder, how we kind of create and we build those rungs, right? And then they kind of become indigenous with our DNA, the imprints of our consciousness, and going like deeper where they become running on autopilot like a supercomputer. And I know you said you have these ladders that you've built and you activate them depending on how you feel, right? And when you do that, is there a way, maybe you've shifted or Dr. Keith, maybe there's a way to rebuild those rungs to better serve you so you have a better foundational ladder? Because that's an amazing way that I've never heard someone say, like rungs of ladder that we create, they become, depending on what wall we put them on. Does that make sense at all? Or?
Yeah, no, I think it does. And I think a lot of the confusion around the question comes from this, it's almost like when we're climbing the rungs ourselves, phenomenologically, it feels like, well, I've left that rung behind. I've reached this new rung, and now I have this new view, however you want to describe the view from that next stage. And we therefore begin to think, well, so I'm I'm beyond all those last rungs that I was on previously. But they're still supporting all of your weight, right? So once you hit like a green level of consciousness, that doesn't mean you don't have access to magenta, into red, into amber, into orange. And that doesn't mean that you probably don't still have a little bit of work to do in terms of, either liberating some splintered off pieces of your consciousness that got traumatized or impacted at a particular stage of development. And when the conditions are right, when the circumstances are, and the stars are aligned in a particular way, that's the part of you that ends up taking, the driving wheel. And then, oftentimes for me anyway, it takes me a day or so to notice that and be like, oh, whoa, when I responded in this way, that wasn't me, or at least that wasn't the me that I feel like I inhabit, 6 out of 7 days. That was something else was sort of speaking through me at that point. So I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes. We think we're past these things, and we've only really begun, I think, to do the work of healing that it requires to to mend whatever damage was done at those previous rungs, which in turn does have some impact on what I'm going to notice and what I'm going to avoid in terms of the view that I have access to now. So I think, Keith, I don't know if you have anything sort of to add to that.
Well, yeah, what Corey's saying is he's reflecting on what he said earlier. Consciousness is a fluid system. We never work through all our stuff. What we do is we get more effective, like that first couple that I described. We get more effective at being aware of it and integrating it. And I wouldn't even say regulating. I think regulating is really useful. Self-regulation is the basis of one of my favorite guys, Alan Shore, and Brian Johnson has talked a lot about it. His philosopher notes, really good guy. But really, what we're doing and what we're looking for is we're looking for integration. We're looking for whatever part of it I want that part to be singing in harmony with the rest of the choir. Now, I'm always aware that the choir is, I'm like the choir director. The self is like the choir director. People are periodically, given how the nature of human existence, somebody starts singing out of key or out of balance. Now, a choir director doesn't pull out a gun and shoot somebody who's singing out of key. He doesn't, take a big stick and knock somebody when they're off the beat. What a good choir director does is he gives them attention. Gives them the attention they need so that they can sing along with the choir. We never lose that responsibility. We're going to be doing that till the day we die. The more we do it, though, the more our unconscious grows. In Shadowlight, I talk a lot about this, about growing your unconscious. The more we do this, the more our unconscious does it for us. And the more we can use our conscious awareness with finer and finer distinctions, with finer and finer radiations. Our relationships become more harmonious. And so we're investing less energy in, fighting about something and more energy about loving each other better. Now, that doesn't mean that primitive stuff doesn't come up, but when primitive stuff comes up, the choir director knows what he's supposed to do. Okay. I got to I don't have a choice. This person has to be singing with the choir, and I need to give this person enough attention, whatever attention is necessary so that the choir is harmonious again. That's my job. And so that's an endless process. Now, as we get better at it, something really fun happens. The better we get at it, the better we notice other people who are good at it. Depth is attracted to depth. That's why I can go any place in the world, and I've done this. And if I'm talking to somebody in integral attitude, they go, God, I know you. I go, yeah, we know each other. Depth knows depth. Okay? People that have never heard of integral, but they spend a lot of time in the second tier. They find somebody who spends a lot of time in the second tier, and they go, yeah. We're beginning to see that a little bit with the millennials who identify more with each other than they do with their nations of origin. And so that part of it is it's an ongoing integrating process. And sometimes we have to do major healing and sometimes less. But as you do more of it, there's less kind of fundamental material that comes up. I have very little fundamental shame issues. I get shame issues, but boy, at 68, I've dealt with most of the fundamental ones. And so that's how it works.
I've only just started.
Anyway, so there you go. So it's really very, very great. Thanks for your questions. Let's give somebody else a chance now.
Thank you, guys.
God bless. Raymond, thank you.
God bless.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Dr.
All right. So our next question is going to be from Sloan. So Sloan, I'm going to bring you on. All right. Let's unmute you. Hello.
I'm here.
Hey, Sloan.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Corey.
Corey.
What you've done is to make me more aware of my confusion. And so I've got three parts to help. I hope you can help me clarify. One is, Keith, what's your working definition of shame? And then secondly, does the shame state manifest itself the same way in all the levels of complexity? And then the third part, I'm not quite clear what I'm asking. Are there core interventions, no matter what level of complexity of shame you're dealing with, or is it tailored to the level of complexity you're dealing with?
So let me answer your questions. A working definition of shame is my nervous system experiences me as breaking a rule and has a particular affect. Shame is a parasympathetic affect that causes me to feel uncomfortable, me to blush a little bit, even if you can't, it's not observable, and from the muscles around this part of my neck to get a little bit, for me to tend to be immobilized. It's a specific.
How is that different from guilt? So would guilt be a different parasympathetic reaction?
Guilt is there's a family of shame reactions. What happens with guilt, though, is you have to have more you have to have more cognitive development to have guilt than to have shame, because guilt involves you having hurt somebody else and feel badly about hurting somebody else.
Right.
That capacity to feel badly about hurting somebody else is a moral achievement. It's a developmental milestone. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's the first part of it. The second part of it is that, yes, shame, the experience of observing, of us feeling like we had a violation and then having that experience, that's universal. How we make meaning out of that experience changes with every developmental shift, and it changes with state of consciousness. It also changes with culture. You know, American culture, for instance, pathology, you know, let's say the interface between type and shame. American culture pathologized being gay and being introverted in the 20th century. So if you were born introverted or gay, the culture had a lot of pressure on you to be ashamed of yourself existentially. Okay.
Yes.
So the culture will determine what the rules are, but it's even more complicated than that, because since our moral systems are include and transcend, I might step on a crack and I feel a little bit of guilt because step on the cracks, break your mother's back.
Yeah.
My unconscious still might have that, you know? Okay. So it manifests differently, but it's the same physiological reaction. Just like Corey and I were talking about that primitive primate reaction to supplant the alpha male. The third part of your question in terms of dealing with shame reactions is to recognize that we discover these reactions, just like most consciousness, we discover stuff, we don't decide to have it. I don't decide to be mad, I discover myself mad. I don't decide to be shamed, I discover myself ashamed. Once I discover myself with an experience and with a story and with an impulse, now I get to decide what to do with that. Now, when people are defensive, they tend to amplify the story they tend to elaborate on the story, they amplify the negative emotion. If I'm mad, the tendency, because it's a protective tendency, to amplify the angry story. If I'm ashamed, I'll amplify the story about me getting more. That is really toxic and causes a lot of problems. So what I want to do is I want to feel that tendency to amplify the story and go, no, once I'm aware of it, now I want to process it in a way that serves the highest good. And if it's shame, I want to find the value I violated and do something about it. If it's anger, I want to find out what I'm angry about. Anger almost always points to an imbalance somewhere, and it makes me mad. Something that's not happening that needs to be happening, or is, and so on, or is happening that shouldn't. Look at the imbalance, and what do I want to do to correct that imbalance while staying attuned to myself and other people? Now, what that does is the amplified or numbed emotions. The numbed emotions tend to stop being numb, they start feeling things. The amplified emotions tend to get more appropriate. The distorted perspectives with compassionate understanding get to be less distorted and more real. The destructive impulses start being supplanted with constructive impulses. I begin to regain my capacity for self reflection, being more aware of myself, and for empathic resonance with you. If I have an integrated consciousness, I know that's my standard, and I notice when I'm not doing that and can adjust to doing it. If I don't have an integrated consciousness, enough arousal will cause me to fragment, and then I am lost in that state until something happens. Okay? So that's the answer to your third question.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great, thanks for asking the question. Happy New Year, Sloan.
Thank you. And to you too also.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really enjoyed the distinction between guilt and shame, Keith. And
Yeah.
you know, on the one hand, it feels like, you know, there's a bit of a spectrum to it. On the other hand,
Yeah,
you know,
there
it
is.
feels like there's probably some sort of like perspectival calculus we could bring to it, where, you know, shame is often being feels anyway, like it's being imposed upon me by something outside of myself, or something outside of myself that I've kind of internalized in some kind of way. Whereas guilt, it feels like it's always the locus of guilt is always coming from an interior place. So that
Well,
feels
another distinction is that shame is more existential. I'm ashamed of myself. Guilt tends to be more specific. I'm guilty about, having, eaten those grapes at the store without paying for them. Okay.
Hmm.
So, guilt is generally a function of a more evolved consciousness that is feeling a more targeted sense of one of the shame emotions. Shame is a more existential sense of I'm bad. Okay. Now they're related in that they're similar parasympathetic aspects, just like mortification is just a little bit different. And also, just to bring the integral back into this, in the second tier, one of the things about the second tier is we discover that language is just inadequate.
Right.
I'm sure I can talk about the neurobiology of shame. That doesn't really give us the sense, or I can talk about the phenomenology of it. We'll all experience it differently. But language does is it's accurate enough to give us guidance in terms of how we manage our interior landscape and our interpersonal landscape. And in that sense, language is very instructive. It's also very revealing. Human beings are more primed to threat than they are to pleasure. If you look in every human culture, there are way more words for painful affects than for pleasurable affects.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Why? Because, we're biased towards what's dangerous. Now, development involves, one, the human superpower of being aware of the past, present, and future. We can feel unsafe all the time. That's not good and causes a lot of anxiety and depression, which is rampant in this culture. If we can continue to develop at a particular point, we can develop an unconscious that says most of the time we're safe. And then we can focus on having more of a proportionate reaction to the world. And a proportionate reaction to the world is things are pretty great and there's little ups and downs. I'm a happy guy who has ups and downs. Okay. That's an appropriate response to the world that I live in. Okay. That's true for most people. But that's a developmental achievement because there's an awful lot of habits of feeling lousy that have to be dealt with. And sometimes we just can't learn new habits. We have to do the work on the traumas that are keeping the old habits in play.
Right. Awesome. All right. Well, let's get some more questions. So just so everyone knows, I'm going to read a question from Raphael, and then I'm going to call on Carolyn, and she's going to join the call. And then we've got a question from Gauri. I think I said that right. So let's start off with Raphael's question. He asks, meeting and getting to know more than one woman at a time feels shameful. Is my nervous system too sensitive, or is my nervous system always right and shows me what my values are? One woman at a time only, please. And I got to say, two things. First off, I really identify with this question because I feel like in a lot of ways, I'm a born monogamist. And I remember, back in my dating days in college and whatnot, I couldn't handle it, right? If I was dating I couldn't even be interested in more than one partner at a time, even if we were just keeping things casually. And I remember one time, I got so overwrought with guilt that I was literally like, no, you've got to put your clothes on and go because this just doesn't feel right. Right. And I was overcome by it. And part of me is like, oh, I felt like I was emasculating myself, like, oh, what kind of guy kicks a girl out and I was doing all these kind of, self-shaming that came out of that.
Yeah,
which,
right.
This isn't how my uncles would have acted. You know what I mean? And the other side was like, well, no, this is who I am. This is what I value, and that's not for me. So it feels like, for Raphael's question, there's probably not a universal answer. It really kind of comes down to what's your cosmic address? What are your background values? Just what are you predisposed to? I don't think there's a single right answer to this necessarily. What do you think, Dr. Keith?
Well, it's certainly a question that's come up an awful lot in the last 45 years. And some people are more monogamous than other people. The vasopressin expression gene has been associated with monogamy in men. The more copies you have, the more monogamous you are. Similarly, levels of testosterone are associated with fidelity and divorce. I mean, there's a lot of physiological stuff, a lot of right quadrant stuff that enters into this. But more specifically, Raphael, what my clients have discovered, and this is independent of whether they're monogamous or polyamorous or something else. People want to be in integrity. You're asking the question because you want to be in integrity.
That's right.
And so I'm always interested with somebody about, all right, say you're single. What way of being in the dating world do you have that leaves you feeling in integrity with your own inner moral landscape? Now, what most of my clients discover is when they reach the point where they're beginning sexual activity with another person, it gets awkward to hang out with other people, sexually, with rare exceptions. Okay, with polyamorous people, hanging out with other people becomes the result of enormous amounts of processing and organization and social organization and self-awareness and so on. One of the statements in the polyamory, one of the aphorisms of polyamory community is swingers have sex, polyamorous people talk about sex all the time. Okay. It's rare that I have a client who feels like it's okay to engage in sexual deception. Even if they're involved in an affair, they feel ashamed of it because they know that somebody's being screwed, being hurt. Often the way that they rationalize it is the person that's being cheated on is, somehow limited, or they're bad, or they don't like sex or something, but there's still a little bit of that. And so the question for you, Raphael, is what leaves you feeling that you're congruent with your own interior moral landscape? And like I said, that's one of the most common solutions that my clients have come. I'll date different people, but if I start being sexual with one person, then I'll just see what's going to happen with that relationship.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Keith, how again, guilt and shame, how both guilt and shame can co-arise, and actually, like in the story I just told you, it can actually pull you in two different directions. On the one hand, I was feeling guilty because I was dating two women at the same time. When I put an end to that, I felt shame because I was somehow not as masculine as whatever role model of masculinity was handed down to me from my family and my culture and so forth.
Yeah, that was your internalized standard. The internalized standard is if you have an opportunity to have sex with somebody, you don't do it, you're less of a man.
That's
Okay,
right.
I was raised in that culture too. Never was comfortable with it. And it was a real relief to go, well, wait a minute. I don't have to have that standard.
Mm-hmm.
I can have a different standard that's more consistent with me. In that sense, for me, I have earned a monogamy. I didn't come to it from any kind of cultural standard. I came from it because that was the only form of being with my partner that I felt great with.
Right.
Not, by the way, not just morally, but sexually.
Right.
There's another question from Gary.
Yeah. And yep. So Gary asks, is shame connected to the creature's perception of his mortal moment or death in his or her environmental context, including his higher perception template? I'm not sure what higher perception template means, but what is the relationship between death and shame?
So our reactions to stress, these are mammalian reactions, are fight, flight, freeze, and life threat. So those are the reactions that mammalian nervous systems go through. Now, freeze and life threat are parasympathetic affects. We lose energy, we lose capacity, we lose consciousness even. Fight or flight are sympathetic affects. These are sympathetic nervous systems. Requires arousal, fight, it causes arousal to flee. Animals will go into, if they feel like they've lost their ability, prey animals especially, but also any animal, if they feel like they've lost their ability to resist, will go into a major parasympathetic collapse. And with animals, it's called feigned death. And it has a lot of the same circuits, the same parasympathetic circuits as shame. And that happens with people too. If people feel like they're overwhelmed, then they'll go into a collapse state, even a dissociative state. Now, that's associated with an enormous amount of shame in human beings. Anybody who is I was physically abused as a child on occasion. And I remember losing all the strength in my body and just kind of collapsing and kind of blanking out when I was being beaten. I was so ashamed of that reaction that I overcompensated. I'm a counterphobic 6 by becoming a major martial artist as I became a teenager. I thought I'd never want to have that experience again. So I really want to be able to fight until I'm, killed. When I learned enough self-discipline, enough spiritual focus, and enough, martial arts techniques, that I was confident that I would be able to protest until I was I would be able to fight back until I was killed or beaten into unconsciousness. There was a part of me that relaxed. Yeah. And so there's not just the experience with humans, there's also how we experience the experience. Often little kids who are molested at 3 or 4 don't feel a particular sense of distress until later on, as they begin to enter other developmental fulcrums, reprocess that experience, and then get traumatized by it. Which is why when you have a trauma, you have to re-experience and reintegrate it through every progressive developmental fulcrum. Animals don't have to do that. Animals will just, if a zebra, avoids a lion, it'll go out into a thicket and it'll just shake for a while and then go start grazing again. It doesn't have the capacity to project into the future or remember into the past as we do. It's been affected, but not in exactly the same way. So yes, that life threat is a parasympathetic collapse, but it's somewhat different from the shame emotion. But we do experience it, and they are related.
So that feigned death response, Keith, is that the reason why? So I know, again, in my own experience, if I'm feeling a spike of shame or anxiety or embarrassment or what have you, it'll often manifest as sleepiness. My body
exactly
shut down and go unconscious for a while. It feels almost like my body's searching for, a reboot. Like if your router's not working, just unplug it and plug it back in. I think that's what my nervous system is trying to do, unplug itself and plug itself back in. But it seems like that is directly related to that animal response of feigned death.
Exactly. It's a dissociative response. If you take an infant and the infant's distressed, first they'll protest, scream, shout, throw up, whatever, and then they'll collapse. They'll go into parasympathetic collapse. Okay, and that's a dissociative state. And unfortunately, the more that you did that as an infant, the more capacities you have for defensive programming as you grow, and the more is required for healing those spots.
Right.
So yeah,
God, we really are just a bunch of monkeys with cell phones, aren't we?
Well, yeah, it's like it's include and transcend. The Buddhists say human beings are the only ones that have God and devil and person under the same skin, and they're right.
Right.
We do, and our job is to integrate all that.
Yeah.
And so I have great affection for all 3 of those things in me. And when they show up, now some of them are more of a problem than others.
Right.
That part of me that collapses, okay. Maybe at some point or another, collapsing will be a good thing to do. I don't know. I mean, I hope I never have to discover it. But if it's the right response, I want to go there.
Mm-hmm.
There's no response that's a wrong response. There's just the wrong response for the moment.
Right.
And and that happens when we have trauma programming. We have a lot of moments where we have the wrong response for the moment.
Right. Yep. No, that's an important point. All right, we're going to bring Carolyn Winter on. Red Rover, send Carolyn on over. Let's unmute.
Carolyn.
Hi, Carolyn.
Here I am. Hi there. I'm so enjoying this show, and honestly, Dr. Keith, your session last month and this month is just going right to my heart. I have to re-listen to this at least 10 times. So I have a real practical question right now, example and question, and maybe you already answered it today, and I'm going to have to re-listen to this to really get it. But given that we just had the holiday season and all that, and I had a dinner party with 2 couples, lifelong friends, 40 years I've known them, and then I invited fatal error. I invited a fifth friend who I've known quite well, but she'd never met these people before. And there was a political discussion. One guy went after this, right-winged conversation about the environment and political policies to my new friend who was way over to the left.
Mhm.
And I thought they were both handling this. It was an interesting conversation. Everybody got dragged in and out of it at various points, but he wouldn't let it go until she just went to what you called last month the Roach Motel. She was just
Easy to get in, hard to get out.
oh God, that's such a great example. But as the host, I mean, I could tell it was just going on too long. And I was trying to make my point and kind of simmer things down a bit. Not doing very well. Finally, I sent one to the kitchen and one over there to do the coffee, and still didn't work because he just kept going after her until she was totally decimated. And I tried to get in there to kind of acknowledge all points, give it an integral point of view, God forbid. And then all of a sudden, quiet descended when I did that. And I could feel myself feeling these feelings like you're talking about. I think it's a combination of embarrassment and shame, because now nobody wants to talk. And the friend that kind of was in the Roach Motel, she just, met me in the kitchen, helped with some dishes, and said, I think it's best I just leave. I'm just being cornered no matter where I go. And I didn't know what else to say. And he just kind of stopped arguing with everybody. He just stopped and just, until everybody kind of left in the next 1 hour. And I was feeling so weird, like I was responsible for the whole thing. And thinking like, how do you stop something? It's like a train going down a track out of control. How do you stop it? And why was I so wrapped up in, like, why couldn't I just go back at him? I don't know. Do you have any insight to offer?
You noticed as you were talking, you went like this. Okay, you did. Okay.
I didn't.
Shame is a I want to hide emotion. People often put their hands over their look down and put their hands over their face. I want to hide. I want to make, like a little kid, I want to make the room disappear. Okay, so I'm going to give you the short answer to this. All right.
Okay.
Okay, the short answer to this is the person with the deepest consciousness in the room has the most responsibility. Okay, and so you're the hostess.
Yeah.
So as a hostess, basically, these people were in altered states, particularly the Trump guy was in altered states. And those kinds of conversations are very, very dangerous because the consciousness, that's a very amber consciousness doesn't care about facts. Okay, green gets morally outraged when people don't care about facts. So it doesn't even matter what you're talking about. If you're having amber talking to green, amber and green are going to have a progressively more frustrating time because amber unconsciously thinks all I have to do is keep imbuing you with my moral contempt for your position and you'll change. Yeah, good luck with that. Green keeps thinking, I'll just keep giving you more and more facts and you'll change. Good luck with that. So since you have the deepest consciousness, which you do, when it starts, you go, you guys are not allowed to have this conversation. You can't talk about this at my dinner table anymore. And the reason why you can't is because this is causing a bad time for everybody. You guys have to talk about something else. You're both good people, but you can't talk about politics here. Stop it. Which eventually is what you did. Okay. And and everybody will go along with it. Okay. And so that's just what you do. That's easier said than done. But once you realize.
That's what I didn't do. I didn't say, hey, enough of this conversation. It's not allowed at my party. It's my party.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what you got to do. And why? Because basically when they're in that state, both of them to a certain extent were in regress states where they were kind of caught up in it and not realizing there's an alternative to this unpleasant engagement.
Yeah.
Okay, which is actually to contribute to the social fabric, which we're not doing. Okay. Yeah. And so what you needed to do is rescue them for that. Just like we have to rescue a couple of kids who are acting up at a party. You go, look, you guys have to, go play quietly. Okay. And so if it ever happens again, you just got to take charge, Carolyn. You got to tell them you got to stop doing it.
I like it. Well, I have to say what you said the last month and this month really is just really made a lot of sense to me. I have taken a quantum leap in this. So I can hardly wait to
Oh,
have
that's
another
great.
party.
Yeah, have another party and then practice it.
Yeah, I'm going to do that. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, it's funny. I think oftentimes integralists forget. Whoop. Oh no. I think I just kicked Keith off of the call. Oh, I was trying to remove Carolyn from the call and I removed Keith instead. Let's wait just a minute for Keith to hop back on. Sorry about that, everyone. We had another question from Raymond, and we'll get to that in just a minute. I'm going to give Keith a call real quick. Yeah, reconnect. I just accidentally kicked you off. That was my fault. I do feel a little bit of shame right now. I feel all this pressure of like all these attendees watching me. And I just feel guilt and shame. Oh, there's Keith. All right, promotes panelist. Oh, come on. Keith, you were here and then you left. So sorry, everyone. Thanks, Raymond. Yeah, you were on and then you left. Get back on. Yeah, let me know how that goes for you. All right, Keith's joining again. All right, I see you. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to promote you to panelist. Don't you move. And he's back.
Boy,
That was a mess. Sorry about that, everyone. I'll just edit this out in post-production. It'll be like no one ever knew.
I love editing.
Thank God for editing.
Thank God for editing.
All
Too
right,
bad
so
we
we
can't
have-
do that in real life.
Yeah, exactly, right? As an Enneagram Type 4, that's how I walk away from every conversation I ever have.
Oh yeah, editing it.
I
Right.
self-edit. I'm like, oh, if I only had said this instead of that. Oh. All right, so we've got another question from Raymond. Let's bring him on. Okay. We had another question from Raymond. I tried to bring him on and he disappeared. Let's see if he comes back. In the meantime, Keith, do we have anything else we want to talk about while we wait to see if Raymond pops back on?
No, I think that we've gone over this pretty thoroughly at the level that we can go over it, you know, in a 1 hour show. part of the purpose of our talks is to talk about how integral exists in a moment-to-moment basis, in a fluid sense, in our individual and our intersubjective consciousness with each other. That's always operating in a variety of contexts, given this whole evolutionary drive that we're surrendering to. And in that sense, it's messy is not exactly the right word, though that's close. Complicated certainly is a good word, though it doesn't really even capture the level of complexity of one human consciousness. But there are principles that emerge out of this. And what I try to do and what you try to do when we talk is, what are the principles that can help guide us? Integral mindfulness is one of those. And cultivating the compassionate witness, and then being very curious about what we can view with equanimity and what we can't. I'm very curious when I find a part of me that I have trouble accepting. Okay, why? Right, this is a piece of work that needs to be done. If I have a sense of compassionate acceptance for a part of me, then I feel pretty okay. Okay, and so, these little distinctions are quite useful for us as humans, because remember, our observing ego can only do so much. We're having all this data coming up all the time, but we're discovering it as it's come up, constructive and destructive material from our adaptive unconscious, from our shadow self. But it helps to have these little kind of gimmicks, these little guideposts about going this direction instead of that direction. And that's a lot of what we do in these talks.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think there was one other.
Yep, Raymond is back on.
Raymond.
Yep, so I'm going to bring him on right now. And with a little bit of luck. All right, just said we'll be bringing Raymond over as a panelist, and I think it booted him again. Raymond, I don't think your question is meant to be, man. I think,
why don't you type it in? Raymond,
yeah,
type your question in.
Yeah, you can come back. You can come back and type it in. That's right. I know he said, let's see here. Can we speak on the topic of transcendence? But that feels like a very open question. So I'm hoping to get a few more specifics from him. But
well,
if we can't get to it, we can get to it next time for sure.
One of the reasons I wrote The Gift of Shame is that, and that was the title of the book, The Gift of Shame, because the more that we develop our capacity to process shame, the more it becomes a transformational tool. The current book that I'm working on, the working title is Trauma into Transcendence. And for the same reason, trauma, as we process it, becomes a tool towards integration, which is transcendence, which is waking up. And so that's what we want. Now, we can't start at the top. Okay. We start wherever we are, and then we recognize, though, that the better we get at this, the more it's going to become a question of, am I in harmony with what I believe God wants me to do? Patricia Albert and I were talking about this the other day, that more and more it becomes, I want to be an authentic channel of spirit into this world through my incarnation. And I feel ashamed if I'm not. Okay, well, it's not a lot of shame, but when I feel a little bit of shame when I'm not, that guides me to do a course adjustment, so I'm feeling a little bit more on course. And that's how shame becomes a spiritual guide, and guilt becomes a spiritual guide, and moral disgust becomes a spiritual guide. Mm. So that's how this fits into transcendence. Now, the problem that a lot of people in Integral have with transcendence, and a lot of people in general have with transcendence, is that when we have a transcendent state or a transcendent moment, we want to think that we're not going to have any regress states anymore, or any non-transcendent moments, or any venal states anymore, okay? Okay, well, we are going to have them. And we're going to regress to previous stages. Just because I spend 50% of my time at teal doesn't mean that I'm not going to be regressing down to red if somebody offends me.
That's right.
Now, I can adjust that, make an adjustment and get back up to teal or not, depending on what I decide. But, so a certain amount of that will be a conscious decision. Now, if I get good at making that conscious decision, that becomes an habitual decision. And then that's vertical development. That's transcendence. And so, we want to do that. And then we kind of discover what it's like when we do it. I always thought if I did this, that I would be happy all the time. Well, what I discover is that I'm happy a lot more of the time, but I've come to be at peace with not being happy all the time. In a way, I wasn't expecting that when I first started doing contemplative practice back in 1965. Okay, I just discovered it as I did contemplative practice. So anyway, yes, shame fits enormously into transcendence. And you know, if you try to take shame out of the transcendence, what you get is spiritual bypassing. And spiritual bypassing, to anybody that's been in the evolutionary movement or anybody in the contemplative movement, is kind of it's the common cold of those movements. And so we don't want a spiritual bypass. We pay a lot of attention to our shame dynamics and our guilt dynamics and our moral disgust dynamics. We are way less likely to engage in spiritual bypassing, and that's a good thing for everybody.
Amen.
So on that note, Happy New Year, everybody. Thanks for so much for tuning in. I'm grateful. I really appreciate it. If you want to know more about my stuff, go to drkeithwitt.com or check out any of my 8 books. You can see them on Amazon. My most recent one being, of course, Loving Completely.
Yeah, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Just a couple announcements before we close. First off, I'm going to be doing a free webinar with Ken Wilber next Saturday at 3 p.m. for our monthly Ken Show dialogue. Please join us. It'll be integrallife.com/live. Otherwise, Jeff Salzman is going to be coming back next week with the Daily Evolver. We're all very excited for his return after the holidays and his knee surgery. And I think on Thursday, he planned on running a dialogue that he recorded with you, Keith. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, on quadrant absolutism. Boy, we had a fun talk. He was so interested in that he came out of his sick bed where he's recovering from his knee replacement to have that conversation. You know, I seduced him with my notes. I'm very proud of him.
Well, to be fair, Jeff's kind of easy to seduce. So, and then, for everyone else, check out our new homepage. I just launched a new homepage on integrallife.com a few days ago, on the first of the year, actually. I thought it was a nice way to bring in the new year. Check it out. Let us know what you think. Go to the community and let us know what you think of the site. And I'm also looking for ideas from you guys on what you think Integral Life should be focused on for the rest of this year, either in shows like this with Dr. Keith or questions with Ken or what have you. What is animating you in 2019? What do you want to see Integral Life explore with you? So let us know. Go to the community, drop us a line, and let us know what's up with you. And otherwise, Keith, thanks again for your time, man. This has been amazing as always. And we'll see you again next month.
Much love to you. Much love to everybody.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.